My father-in-law told me I'd never be good enough for his daughter. I made him eat those words publicly. Richard Thornhill stood at the microphone during my wedding reception and told 300 guests that I was marrying above my station. Those were his exact words. He said his daughter deserved someone with a real career, not a struggling teacher who barely made $38,000 a year. He said Claire had been raised with certain expectations, and he doubted I could provide the life she deserved. Then he sat down while half the room stared at their plates in uncomfortable silence, and the other half pretended they hadn't heard anything wrong. My new wife squeezed my hand under the table, her face red with humiliation and rage. I smiled and raised my glass, pretending the wealthiest man in our county hadn't just told everyone I was worthless. That was 5 years ago, and I'd been swallowing his insults ever since, letting him believe he was right about me. But 3 weeks ago, everything changed when I discovered what he'd been doing behind my back. Now I had proof of things that would destroy his reputation forever, and I was going to make sure everyone knew the truth. I'd been teaching high school English in Riverside, Pennsylvania for 6 years when I met Claire at a community fundraiser. She was volunteering at the book sale table, wearing jeans and a sweater, her dark hair pulled back in a ponytail. She looked nothing like the daughter of the man who owned half the commercial real estate in 3 counties. We talked about Steinbeck and Morrison for 20 minutes before she asked if I wanted to get coffee sometime. I said yes without knowing her last name was Thornhill, without understanding that her father would see me as an obstacle to whatever arranged marriage he'd planned for his only child. Our first date lasted 6 hours. The second date, Richard showed up at the restaurant where we were having dinner, claiming it was a coincidence, even though Claire later told me he'd never eaten there before in his life. He looked at my 10-year-old Subaru in the parking lot and asked what I did for a living. When I said I taught English at Riverside High, his expression shifted from suspicious to openly dismissive. Richard made his position clear from the beginning. During our third dinner together at Claire's apartment, he stopped by unannounced and found me cooking pasta in her kitchen. He asked how much my salary was, right there in front of his daughter, like I was applying for a loan. When I told him teachers in our district made between $35,000 and $55,000 depending on experience, he actually laughed. He said he paid his groundskeeper more than that and couldn't imagine how I expected to support a family. Claire told him to leave, her voice shaking with anger. After he left, she apologized for 2 hours, explaining that her father had always been controlling and judgmental, that he'd driven away every boyfriend she'd ever had with exactly this kind of behavior. She said if I couldn't handle her father's attitude, she'd understand. I told her I wasn't going anywhere because I loved her, not her father's opinion of me. That was the truth then, and it stayed true through everything that came after. Richard escalated his campaign against me over the next year. He offered me money to break up with Claire, starting at $10,000 and eventually reaching $50,000, like I was some kind of mercenary who could be bought off. When I refused every offer, he tried a different approach. He started inviting Claire to family events and specifically told her not to bring me. He scheduled important family dinners on nights he knew I had school commitments. He bought her a new BMW and told her she should be with someone who could afford to buy her nice things without his help. At Claire's birthday dinner, he seated me at the far end of the table away from her next to her cousin's husband who spent the entire meal telling me about his successful investment banking career. The message was clear. This is what success looks like, and you're not it. I ate my steak and smiled and pretended not to notice the performance, but my hands were clenched under the table hard enough that my nails left marks in my palms. When I proposed to Claire after 18 months together, Richard demanded a meeting at his office downtown. His building was all glass and steel, with his name on a bronze plaque in the lobby. His secretary led me to a conference room on the 20th floor, where Richard sat behind a massive desk with a view of the entire city. He didn't offer me a seat. He told me that if I insisted on marrying his daughter, I needed to sign a prenuptial agreement that would protect his family's assets from my inevitable failure. He said it with complete confidence, like my failure was a documented fact, rather than his bitter prediction. The prenup his lawyer presented was 38 pages long and contained clauses that would leave me with nothing if the marriage ended, regardless of circumstances or fault. I read every page while Richard watched me with satisfaction, probably expecting me to argue or storm out. Instead, I signed it without hesitation, because I wasn't marrying Claire for money. I was marrying her because she was brilliant and kind and saw value in things that couldn't be quantified on a balance sheet. The wedding was entirely Richard's production. He insisted on paying for everything, which gave him control over every detail. He invited his business associates and political connections, turning what should have been an intimate ceremony into a networking event with 400 guests Claire and I barely knew. He hired a wedding planner who ignored our input and executed his vision of what a Thornhill wedding should look like. He even tried to veto my best man choice, saying my college roommate wasn't impressive enough for the role. Claire fought him on that one and won, but it cost her weeks of arguments and tears. The wedding day itself was beautiful on the surface, expensive flowers and a live orchestra, but it felt hollow because Richard had stripped away everything personal we'd wanted. And then came his speech during the reception, the one where he told everyone I was marrying above my station and probably couldn't provide for his daughter. I watched Claire's face crumble as her father humiliated both of us in front of everyone we knew. My mother-in-law touched Richard's arm and whispered something, but he shook her off. He meant every word, and he wanted to make sure I knew it. The first year of marriage was hard, because Richard never stopped reminding me of my inadequacy. At Christmas, he gave Claire a check for $20,000 and gave me a book about financial planning for beginners. At Easter, he announced he was adding Claire to his corporate accounts so she'd never have to worry about money. When Claire told him she didn't want or need his money, that we were fine on our combined income, Richard looked at me and said I should be ashamed for letting my wife suffer through a middle-class lifestyle when she'd been raised with so much more. Claire defended me every time, told her father he was wrong about me, but I could see it wearing her down. The constant criticism, the endless comparisons to wealthier men, the implication that she'd made a mistake choosing me over the life Richard had planned for her. I hated watching him hurt her, hated feeling like maybe he was right, and I was dragging her down into a life of mediocrity. Then Claire got pregnant, and Richard's attacks intensified. He cornered me at the hospital after our first ultrasound and asked how I planned to afford childcare on a teacher's salary. He said Claire should quit her job as a social worker to raise the baby properly, but that would mean living on my income alone. He calculated the numbers out loud, totaling our bills and comparing them to my salary, showing me the monthly deficit. He offered to supplement our income with a monthly allowance, his voice dripping with condescension. I told him we'd figure it out without his help, and he laughed. He said pride was a luxury I couldn't afford, that I needed to accept reality and let him help support his grandchild since I clearly couldn't do it alone. I walked away from that conversation with my jaw clenched so tight, I gave myself a headache that lasted 3 days. When our daughter Emma was born, Richard showed up at the hospital with a trust fund he'd established in her name. He told Claire the money was for Emma's future, but he looked directly at me when he said it would ensure she had opportunities, even if her father couldn't provide them. I buried myself in work after Emma was born, taking on extra duties at school to prove I could provide more. I started teaching summer school classes, volunteering for after-school tutoring, programs that came with stipends, and coaching the debate team because it added $2,000 to my annual salary. Richard noticed and commented on it during every family dinner. He'd ask Claire how much time I was spending at home, implying I was neglecting my family to chase pennies. He'd mention articles he'd read about work-life balance and the importance of fathers being present for their children. Every comment was designed to make me look inadequate, either as a provider if I didn't work enough or as a father if I worked too much. There was no winning scenario in Richard's worldview. I was doomed to fail simply by being who I was, and he was determined to document every misstep along the way. What I didn't know then was that Richard was actively sabotaging me behind the scenes. 2 years into our marriage, I applied for a position as assistant principal at Riverside High. The job would have meant a significant salary increase and administrative experience that could lead to a principal position eventually. I had the qualifications, the recommendations, and a strong interview. The superintendent told me I was the leading candidate and to expect good news within a week. Then silence. 2 weeks passed with no communication. When the announcement finally came, they'd hired an external candidate with less experience and weaker credentials. I ran into the superintendent at a school board meeting a month later and asked what happened. He looked uncomfortable and said sometimes decisions come from above his pay grade. He wouldn't elaborate, but the way he glanced away told me there was more to the story. I had no proof Richard was involved, but the timing was suspicious, and it fit his pattern of interference. The second incident happened a year later when I was nominated for the state's Teacher of Excellence Award. The nomination came from my department chair and was supported by student testimonials and my record of improved test scores, making it to the finalist stage would have meant recognition, a cash prize of $5,000, and significant career advancement opportunities. I prepared my presentation carefully, rehearsing my teaching philosophy and gathering evidence of student success. The day before my finalist interview, I received an email saying my nomination had been withdrawn due to questions about my professional conduct. No details were provided, no opportunity to defend myself. I called the awards committee and was told an anonymous complaint had been filed, claiming I showed favoritism to certain students and was difficult to work with. Anyone who knew me understood both accusations were ridiculous, but anonymous complaints are hard to fight. The nomination was withdrawn, and another teacher from our district went on to win the regional award. I started noticing other strange patterns. A grant I'd applied for to fund a new creative writing program was denied despite meeting all criteria. A speaking opportunity at a state education conference was mysteriously canceled after I'd already been confirmed. Letters of recommendation I'd requested from former professors went unanswered or arrived too late to be useful. Each incident seemed small and explainable on its own, but together they formed a pattern of obstacles appearing whenever I tried to advance professionally. I mentioned it to Claire once, carefully, and she got very quiet. She asked if I thought her father might be involved. I said I didn't know, but it seemed like too many coincidences. She promised to talk to him, to find out if he was interfering. The next family dinner, Richard was extra friendly to me, asking about school and complimenting my dedication. It felt performative, like he was putting on a show for Claire while secretly laughing at me. The breakthrough came 3 months ago during a school board meeting. I was presenting a proposal for expanded arts programming when I noticed Raymond Castellano in the back row. Raymond was on the board of Richard's commercial real estate company, a connection I knew because I'd seen them together at family events. He was paying very close attention to my presentation, taking notes and watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. After the meeting, Raymond approached me in the parking lot. He said he wanted to talk privately about something important, something I needed to know about Richard. We agreed to meet for coffee the next day at a place across town where we wouldn't run into anyone we knew. I spent that night wondering what Raymond could possibly tell me that would require such secrecy, my mind racing through possibilities that ranged from financial crimes to family secrets. Raymond showed up to the coffee shop looking nervous, constantly checking over his shoulder like he expected Richard to appear. He told me he'd worked for Richard for 15 years and recently retired from the company board. He said his conscience had been bothering him about things he'd witnessed, things Richard had done to hurt me. I asked him to explain, my hands wrapped around my coffee cup to keep them steady. Raymond said Richard had been systematically sabotaging my career for years, using his wealth and connections to close doors before I even knew they were open. He confirmed Richard had pressured the school board to hire someone else for the assistant principal position, threatening to withdraw a major donation to the district's building fund if they promoted me. He said Richard had filed the anonymous complaint that killed my Teacher of Excellence nomination, fabricating allegations he knew couldn't be proven, but would be enough to disqualify me. Every obstacle I'd faced, every opportunity that mysteriously disappeared, Richard had orchestrated it all. I felt sick listening to Raymond describe the extent of Richard's interference. But Raymond wasn't finished. He pulled out a folder from his briefcase and slid it across the table. Inside were documents, emails, and recorded phone calls that proved everything he'd told me. Richard's emails to the school superintendent explicitly threatening funding cuts if I was promoted. Text messages to the awards committee claiming I was under investigation for misconduct. Letters to grant organizations saying I was unreliable and recommending they fund other applicants. Notes from Richard's personal files about tracking my career and identifying opportunities to undermine. Raymond had copied everything before retiring, knowing someone needed to stop Richard, but afraid to act while he still worked for him. He said he'd watched me struggle for years while Richard destroyed me piece by piece, and he couldn't stay silent anymore. He said Richard had done similar things to others who crossed him, but I was the project Richard had pursued with the most dedication and cruelty. I asked Raymond why he was telling me this now, why he was risking Richard's wrath to help me. He said his daughter had recently married a teacher against his initial objections, and watching their happiness made him realize how wrong he'd been to judge based on income rather than character. He said I reminded him of his son-in-law, someone decent and hardworking being crushed by a powerful man's ego. He'd seen enough of Richard's vindictive behavior and didn't want to be complicit anymore. He said I could use the documents however I wanted, that he was prepared to testify if needed. Then he told me something that made my blood run cold. Richard was planning something bigger, a final move designed to destroy my reputation so completely that Claire would have no choice but to leave me. Raymond didn't know the specifics, but he'd overheard Richard on the phone 3 weeks ago saying it was time to end this marriage once and for all. I thanked Raymond and took the folder, my hands shaking as I held the evidence of Richard's systematic destruction of my career and reputation. I sat in my car for 30 minutes after Raymond left, reading through every document, every email, every piece of proof that my father-in-law had spent years trying to ruin my life. The anger was overwhelming, burning in my chest like acid. But underneath the anger was something else. Clarity. For years, I'd questioned myself, wondered if maybe Richard was right about me being inadequate and insufficient. Now I knew the truth. Every failure wasn't my fault. Every closed door had been deliberately shut by a man who couldn't accept that his daughter chose love over money. I drove home and locked the folder in my desk drawer, not ready to tell Claire yet, because I needed to think through my next move carefully. Exposing Richard would hurt Claire, would damage her relationship with her father permanently. But keeping silent meant allowing him to continue sabotaging me until he finally succeeded in destroying our marriage. That night, Claire told me her father wanted us to come to dinner on Saturday, just the 3 of us, plus her mother. She said it was important to him, that he wanted to talk about Emma's future and family plans. Something in her voice sounded off, like she knew more than she was saying but couldn't bring herself to tell me. I agreed to the dinner while my mind raced with questions about what Richard might be planning. Was this the final move Raymond had warned me about? Was Richard going to make some ultimatum, some offer designed to split us apart? I needed to be prepared, needed to have a strategy going into whatever confrontation was coming. I spent the next 3 days reviewing Raymond's documents and making copies, storing originals in a safe deposit box, and keeping copies hidden in 3 different locations. If Richard was planning to destroy me, I was going to make sure I could prove exactly what he'd been doing. Saturday arrived and we drove to Richard's house, a sprawling estate with a circular driveway and professionally maintained gardens. Claire's mother, Nancy, greeted us at the door with hugs and took Emma to play in the sunroom, while Richard led Claire and me to his study. The room was exactly what you'd expect from Richard. Expensive furniture, walls lined with books he'd probably never read, and photographs of himself with politicians and business leaders. He gestured for us to sit in the leather chairs facing his desk while he remained standing, establishing dominance through height and position. He said he'd been thinking a lot about our family's future and Claire's happiness. He said he'd tried to be patient, tried to give me time to prove I could provide adequately for his daughter. But after 5 years, he'd seen enough to know I would never be the husband Claire deserved. The words came out smooth and rehearsed, like he'd been practicing this speech. Richard pulled out a folder from his desk drawer and placed it in front of Claire. He said he'd hired a private investigator to look into my activities over the past year. The folder contained photographs of me meeting with various women, taken from angles that made innocent interactions look suspicious. Me having coffee with a female colleague from school, cropped to remove the 3 other teachers at our table. Me talking to a parent in a parking lot, photographed to suggest intimacy rather than a discussion about her son's grades. Me at a restaurant with my sister, whose face had been deliberately cropped out to make it look like a romantic dinner. Richard said the evidence showed a pattern of infidelity and betrayal, that I'd been cheating on Claire throughout our marriage. He said he'd kept quiet, hoping I would confess and spare everyone the pain of exposure, but my continued deception forced his hand. Claire looked at the photographs with horror and confusion, her face pale. Before she could speak, I pulled out my phone and started showing her the full, uncropped versions of several photos. The coffee meeting with clearly visible colleagues. The restaurant dinner with timestamps showing it was my sister's birthday. The parking lot conversation with a parent whose emails I could prove were only about academics. Richard's face darkened as Claire realized the photographs had been deliberately manipulated to create a false narrative. She turned to her father and asked what he thought he was doing. He said he was protecting her from a man who wasn't worthy of her, that I'd probably manipulated the evidence just like I'd manipulated her. I reached into my bag and pulled out the folder Raymond had given me. I placed it on Richard's desk and told him I knew everything. I knew about the assistant principal position he'd sabotaged. I knew about the Teacher of Excellence award he'd destroyed with false allegations. I knew about every grant, opportunity, and advancement he'd blocked over 5 years. I had emails, recorded conversations, and witness testimony documenting his systematic campaign to ruin my career. Claire stared at her father, waiting for him to deny it. Richard didn't deny it. He said everything he'd done was to protect Claire from making a permanent mistake with someone beneath her. Claire stood up, her body shaking with rage. She asked her father how he could do this, how he could lie and manipulate and sabotage someone she loved. Richard said he did it because he loved her, because fathers make hard choices to protect their children from bad decisions. Claire told him the only bad decision she'd made was believing he would eventually accept me and stop his crusade. She said we were leaving and she didn't want to speak to him until he was ready to genuinely apologize. Richard blocked the doorway and said if we left now, she was choosing me over her family. He said he would cut her off completely. No more financial help, no more trust funds for Emma, no more family events. He said she needed to decide right now whether she wanted a life with me or a life with her family. Claire looked at him with tears streaming down her face and said she'd already made that choice 5 years ago when she married me. We walked out with Richard shouting behind us that we'd regret this, that I'd dragged his daughter down into poverty, and she'd blame me eventually. The drive home was silent, except for Emma chattering in the back seat about the toys Grandma had let her play with. Claire stared out the window while tears rolled down her cheeks. When we got home and put Emma to bed, Claire collapsed on the couch and cried for an hour. She said she'd known her father was difficult and controlling, but she'd never imagined he would go this far. She'd never thought he would fabricate evidence of infidelity or systematically destroy my career. She asked if I was okay, if I could forgive her for not seeing what he was doing sooner. I held her and said none of this was her fault, that Richard's cruelty was his choice and his responsibility. But inside, I was planning my next move. Raymond had given me evidence, but confronting Richard privately had accomplished nothing except getting us temporarily disowned. If I wanted real justice, if I wanted Richard to face consequences for his actions, I needed to expose him publicly in a way he couldn't deny or spin. Monday morning, I called attorney Douglas Brennan, a lawyer I knew from school board meetings who specialized in defamation and employment law. I made an appointment for that afternoon and brought Raymond's folder with me. Douglas's office was modest compared to the polished corporate spaces I'd visited with Richard, but his credentials on the wall showed 25 years of experience winning cases against powerful defendants. I spread the documents across his conference table and explained everything. The sabotaged promotion, the destroyed award nomination, the blocked opportunities, the fabricated infidelity evidence. Douglas listened carefully, making notes and occasionally asking questions. When I finished, he said I had a strong case for intentional interference with business relationships and potentially defamation if Richard's false allegations had damaged my reputation. He said we could sue Richard civilly and likely win significant damages. But he warned me that suing my father-in-law would be expensive, time-consuming, and emotionally devastating for my family. I told Douglas I wasn't interested in money, or even a legal victory. I wanted Richard exposed publicly so everyone who'd witnessed his treatment of me over the years would know the truth. I wanted his business associates to know he'd threatened school funding to sabotage his son-in-law's career. I wanted his social circle to know he'd fabricated evidence of infidelity. I wanted everyone who'd heard his wedding toast about me marrying above my station to see proof that he'd spent 5 years trying to destroy me because I wasn't wealthy enough for his standards. Douglas said public exposure was possible, but required strategy. He suggested we approach the local newspaper with the story, backed by the documentary evidence. He said journalists loved stories about wealthy, powerful figures abusing their influence, especially when there was clear documentation. He offered to reach out to investigative reporter Helen McKay at the Riverside Tribune, someone he'd worked with before on similar cases. She had a reputation for thorough, fearless reporting and wouldn't be intimidated by Richard's wealth or threats. I went home and talked to Claire about going public with the story. She was quiet for a long time, processing what it would mean to expose her father's behavior to the entire community. She said it would destroy his reputation and probably damage his business. She said her mother would be humiliated, and her extended family would take sides. She said there was no going back once we made this information public. Then she looked at me and said her father had been systematically destroying the man she loved for 5 years, and she couldn't let that continue. She said if exposing him was the only way to stop him, then we should do it. She said she was tired of making excuses for his behavior and pretending his cruelty was just concern. She wanted our daughter to grow up knowing her parents stood up for what was right, even when it was hard. We called Douglas that night and told him to contact Helen McKay. Within 2 days, we had a meeting scheduled at the Tribune offices. Helen McKay was exactly what I'd hoped for, sharp, thorough, and visibly angry as she reviewed the evidence. She was in her late 40s with gray-streaked hair and the intense focus of someone who'd spent decades exposing corruption and abuse. She went through every document carefully, taking notes and asking detailed questions about dates, names, and specific incidents. She recorded our interview with our permission, stopping occasionally to verify details or request clarification. She said the story was solid from a journalistic standpoint because we had extensive documentation rather than just allegations. She said she'd need to contact Richard for comment before publication, which would give him warning that the story was coming. She said he'd likely threaten lawsuits and try to kill the story through pressure on the newspaper's ownership. But she'd dealt with wealthy defendants before and wasn't afraid of legal threats when the evidence was this clear. She said the article would run in 10 days if her editor approved, which she was confident he would given the strength of our documentation. The next week was tense, waiting for Richard's response. Helen called on Wednesday to say she'd reached out to Richard for comment and he'd been predictably furious. He'd threatened to sue the newspaper, threatened to pull advertising from his commercial properties, threatened Helen personally with defamation charges. He'd denied everything despite being confronted with his own emails and recorded calls. He'd claimed the documents were fabricated, and I was trying to destroy him because he'd rightfully criticized my inadequacy as a provider. Helen said his response was perfect because it showed his character and would be included in the article. She said the story was running Sunday in the newspaper's special investigations section with full documentation posted online. She warned us to prepare for backlash, that Richard's allies would defend him and we'd face social consequences. But she said the evidence was too strong for anyone reasonable to deny, and the truth needed to be told. Saturday night, Claire and I couldn't sleep. We both knew everything would change tomorrow when that article published. Our phones would explode, Richard's friends would attack us, and Claire's family would fracture along lines of loyalty and denial. But we'd made our choice, and there was no turning back. At 6 a.m. Sunday, Helen texted that the article was live online. I opened the Riverside Tribune website on my laptop, and there it was, front page of the digital edition with the headline, "Wealthy businessman systematically sabotaged son-in-law's career for years, documents show." The article was thorough and devastating, laying out Richard's campaign of interference with specific examples and direct quotes from his own emails. Helen had included Richard's denial, but contrasted it with the overwhelming documentary evidence. She'd interviewed Raymond Castellano, who'd gone on record confirming everything. She'd obtained statements from the school superintendent and awards committee admitting they'd been pressured by Richard. She'd even found 2 other people Richard had similarly targeted over business disputes, establishing a pattern of vindictive behavior. The article went viral within hours. Local news stations picked it up for their Sunday broadcasts. Regional papers ran summaries linking to the full Tribune investigation. By noon, it was trending on social media, with people sharing screenshots of Richard's most damning emails. My phone was blowing up with messages from colleagues, friends, and former students expressing shock and support. The school superintendent called to apologize for caving to Richard's pressure 5 years ago, saying the board would be reviewing the assistant principal position with me as the priority candidate. The State Teaching Association reached out to say they were reopening my Teacher of Excellence nomination. Reporters from 3 different outlets requested interviews. It was overwhelming and validating and terrifying all at once. Claire's phone was similarly flooded, but many of her messages were from family members demanding explanations or accusing us of betrayal. Her mother called 6 times before Claire finally answered, and I could hear Nancy crying through the speaker, asking how Claire could do this to her father. Richard called at 2 p.m., his voice tight with barely controlled rage. He said I'd destroyed him, that his business partners were already distancing themselves, and 2 major clients had canceled contracts. He said the country club had received dozens of complaints about his membership, and there were calls for his removal from several non-profit boards. He said I'd humiliated him in front of the entire community over petty grievances and jealousy. I told him every word in that article was true and backed by his own documentation. I told him he'd spent 5 years trying to destroy me, and now he was facing the consequences of his actions. He said I'd turned his daughter against him, and I'd regret this for the rest of my life. I told him the only thing I regretted was not exposing him sooner, that maybe if people had known what he was doing, he would have stopped before inflicting so much damage. He hung up on me, and Claire started crying because hearing her father so broken was painful, despite everything he'd done. Monday morning, I went to school expecting awkwardness or judgment, but instead, I was met with overwhelming support. Teachers stopped me in the hallway to say they'd always suspected Richard was behind my blocked promotion. Students asked if the article was true and said it was messed up what my father-in-law had done. The principal called me into her office and formally apologized for the district's role in sabotaging my career, saying the superintendent had pressured her to support the external candidate against her professional judgment. She said the assistant principal position would be posted again and I should absolutely apply. She said she'd personally recommend me and ensure the decision was based on merit this time. I thanked her and left her office feeling something I hadn't felt in 5 years. Hope that my career might finally move forward based on my actual work rather than Richard's interference. The community response was largely supportive, though Richard had his defenders. Several wealthy business owners wrote letters to the editor calling the article a hit piece and defending Richard's character. A few of Claire's relatives posted on social media claiming we'd exaggerated and manipulated the story, but the evidence was too strong for most people to dismiss. The emails were real, the recordings were clear, Raymond's testimony was credible. Public opinion turned decisively against Richard, as more details emerged about his pattern of vindictive behavior. The country club did revoke his membership after 63 members signed a petition citing conduct unbecoming. 2 nonprofit boards asked for his resignation. His commercial real estate company issued a statement distancing themselves from his personal actions and announcing his transition to a less public role in the organization. The social and professional consequences were exactly what I'd hoped for. Real accountability for years of cruel manipulation. 3 weeks after the article published, Claire's mother called asking if we could meet for coffee. Just the 2 of us, without Richard. I agreed and met Nancy at a quiet cafe across town. She looked tired and older than I remembered, the stress of the situation clearly weighing on her. She said she needed to apologize for not stopping Richard sooner, for knowing he was too harsh with me but telling herself he'd eventually come around. She said she'd found evidence over the years that Richard was interfering with my career, but she'd convinced herself he was just being protective rather than destructive. She said reading the article had forced her to confront truths she'd been avoiding, and she was ashamed of her complicity. She asked if I could forgive her for not being stronger, for not standing up to her husband when she should have. I told her I understood how hard it was to challenge someone like Richard, that I didn't blame her for his choices. She thanked me and said she was proud I'd finally stood up to him, that someone needed to hold him accountable. Nancy said, Richard had been different since the article published, quieter and less confident. He'd lost weight and wasn't sleeping well. Several long-time friendships had ended over his exposed behavior. His business was suffering from the reputational damage, and he'd stepped back from day-to-day operations. Nancy said she'd told him he needed to apologize to us, needed to acknowledge what he'd done and try to make amends. Richard had refused, saying he'd done nothing wrong and we'd blown everything out of proportion. Nancy said she was tired of defending him and making excuses. She said for the first time in their 38-year marriage, she was seriously considering leaving him. She asked about Claire and Emma, wanting to know if she could still have a relationship with them, even if Richard wouldn't apologize. I told her that was between her and Claire, but I personally had no objection to Emma knowing her grandmother. Nancy cried and thanked me, saying she'd been terrified we'd cut her off completely. 4 months after the article, I was offered the assistant principal position at Riverside High with a salary increase to $62,000. The interview process was fair and transparent, with my qualifications properly evaluated without external interference. I accepted the position and felt genuine pride in an achievement that was mine, earned through my work rather than compromised by Richard's sabotage. Claire got a promotion at her social work agency around the same time, moving into a program director role with better pay and benefits. Together, our combined income was comfortable and stable, not wealthy by Richard's standards, but more than adequate for our needs. We celebrated by taking Emma to the beach for a week, the first real vacation we'd taken in years. On that beach, watching Emma build sandcastles while Claire read beside me, I felt something I'd been missing. Peace. Not because Richard was suffering, but because I'd finally proven I was good. Enough, regardless of his opinion. The Teaching Award Committee reached out 6 months after the article to say they were reopening my nomination for the following year's recognition cycle. They apologized for allowing Richard's false complaint to derail my previous nomination and said they'd implemented new policies to prevent similar manipulation. I went through the process again, this time without sabotage, and won the Regional Teacher of Excellence Award. The ceremony included a $5,000 prize and recognition in front of 300 educators from across the state. Claire and Emma attended, sitting in the front row and cheering when my name was called. Nancy was there too, having driven 3 hours to watch me receive an honor her husband had tried to destroy. Richard wasn't invited and didn't attend, but I knew he would hear about it through mutual connections. I hoped it stung, hoped it forced him to confront the reality that I'd succeeded despite everything he'd done to stop me. A year after the article published, Richard finally reached out through Nancy asking if he could meet with me. Just the two of us, he said, to talk without lawyers or reporters or audiences. I was skeptical, but agreed, curious what he could possibly say after everything that had happened. We met at a neutral location, a park bench near the river where we'd be in public but could talk privately. Richard looked diminished somehow, less imposing than the man who'd towered over me at my wedding reception. He said he'd spent the year thinking about what he'd done and why he'd done it. He said he'd been wrong to treat me the way he had, wrong to let his ego and pride dictate his actions. He said watching his relationship with Claire disintegrate had forced him to examine his priorities and his behavior. He said losing his social standing and professional reputation had been humiliating, but losing his daughter's respect had been devastating. Richard said he couldn't undo. The damage he'd caused couldn't give me back the 5 years he'd stolen with his interference. But he wanted me to know he was sorry, genuinely sorry for the pain he'd inflicted on me, and especially on Claire. He said he'd been so focused on what he thought Claire deserved that he'd failed to see what actually made her happy. He said watching me succeed, despite his sabotage, had proven I was stronger and more capable than he'd ever given me credit for. He said he was proud of the husband I'd been to his daughter and the father I was to his granddaughter, even though he had no right to that pride after trying to destroy me. He asked if there was any possibility of rebuilding our relationship, any chance I could forgive him enough to let him be part of our family again. I told him I'd think about it, that forgiveness would take time and would depend on his actions rather than his words. I went home and talked to Claire about her father's apology. She said she'd been getting similar messages from him through her mother, expressions of regret and requests for reconciliation. She said part of her wanted to forgive him because he was her father and she remembered loving him before everything went wrong. But another part of her couldn't forget the years of cruelty, the systematic destruction of her husband's career, the manipulated photographs designed to end our marriage. She said she needed time to process everything, to decide if Richard's apology was genuine or just another manipulation. We agreed to take things slowly, allowing Nancy to continue her relationship with Emma while keeping Richard at a distance until we saw evidence of real change. 6 months later, Richard sent a formal written apology to the school board, acknowledging his inappropriate interference and taking full responsibility for his actions. He made a substantial donation to the district's teacher development fund with no strings attached. He wrote letters to the teaching award committee and grant organizations he'd sabotaged, confessing his false allegations and asking them to delete his previous complaints from their records. These actions felt more meaningful than words, concrete attempts to repair the damage he'd caused. Claire started allowing supervised visits with Richard, short meetings at Nancy's house where Emma could see her grandfather while we maintained boundaries. Richard was different in these interactions, quieter and more respectful. He asked about my work and seemed genuinely interested in my answer. He complimented Claire without comparing her to other people's daughters. He played with Emma without trying to buy her affection with expensive gifts. It wasn't forgiveness yet, but it was progress. Slowly, over months of consistent better behavior, my anger began to fade into something more complicated. I couldn't forget what Richard had done, but I could acknowledge that people are capable of change when they face real consequences for their actions. 2 years after the article, Richard attended Emma's 6th birthday party. It was the first family event we'd invited him to since the confrontation in his study. He brought a modest gift and stayed in the background, letting us host without his interference or control. He helped set up chairs without being asked and cleaned up trash after the kids destroyed the backyard with their games. At the end of the party, he pulled me aside and said thank you for giving him another chance. He said he knew he'd never fully earn back what he'd destroyed, but he was grateful for the opportunity to try. I told him we were all moving forward as best we could, that holding on to anger would only hurt us more. He nodded and shook my hand, and I felt something shift. Not complete forgiveness, but release. I'd proven everything I needed to prove. Richard had faced consequences for his actions. Our family was healing on our terms. Now, 3 years after that article published, life is good. I'm in my 2nd year as assistant principal with a clear path toward principalship. Claire's thriving in her director role, making a real difference in our community's social services. Emma's 8 and brilliant, asking questions that remind me why I became a teacher. Richard is part of our lives in a limited, carefully managed way. He's better than he was, but still carries the weight of what he did. Nancy is happier now that Richard has been forced to change. The family gatherings are smaller and more genuine without the performance of wealth and status that Richard used to require. I still see shadows of his old contempt sometimes, moments when I catch him comparing me to other people's sons-in-law. But now I just smile because I know my worth isn't determined by his approval. I've proven I'm good enough for his daughter by building a strong marriage and stable life based on love rather than money. And Richard knows it too, which is why he works so hard now to hide his old prejudices. He lost the right to judge me when the community saw what he'd been doing behind everyone's backs. The other day, I ran into one of Richard's former business partners at a school event. He pulled me aside and said he'd always thought I was too quiet when Richard made his cutting comments at dinners and gatherings. He said reading that article had made him realize I wasn't quiet because I accepted Richard's judgment, but because I was confident enough not to need his approval. He said standing up to Richard the way I did took courage that most people don't have, especially when you're facing someone with his wealth and power. He apologized for not speaking up when Richard humiliated me at the wedding reception and other events. He said watching me succeed despite Richard's sabotage had been inspiring, proof that integrity matters more than money. I thanked him and thought about how victory doesn't always look like you expect. I didn't destroy Richard financially or make him suffer the way he made me suffer. But I exposed the truth and let consequences follow naturally. Richard lost his reputation, his social standing, and his daughter's unconditional love. He gained humility, accountability, and the understanding that class isn't about wealth. That feels like justice to me. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.